Hi, Misha here, and this is one I've been planning for, well, at least a month, and one that I teased over on the main Mishaco channel when doing the April update. We're going to finally take a look, relatively in depth, at Germany's Unterseeboot fleet of World War II. And all these models are 1/350 scale diecast made by Atlas Editions. So relatively good size. I mean, large enough for some good detail. These all have main bodies made of metal with the decking mostly polymer for detail work. They all come on wooden bases with little metal name plaques. Pretty neat for the relatively low price. And yeah, we're gonna cover the whole series here for the most part. We'll talk about the Type 1. I have an example of the Type 1A. Then we're going to get in to the small little coastal boats, the Type 2. I've got a Type 2B and a Type 2C. Then we're going to get into the kind of the mainstay, the workhorse of the fleet, as it's often called, the Type 7. I have a Type 7B and a Type 7D. After that, we'll get, and by the way, the Type 7 is kind of classified as a medium range, a little more than a coastal, but not really designed to go across the Atlantic, although in a pinch they were able to do just that, but it was not a fun thing. But the Type 9 over here was designed for long-range ocean going. They could cross the Atlantic without a whole big deal. In fact, some of them went all the way over to Japan and India. And I've got a Type 9C and a Type 9D2, which is a very large long-range boat. No matter how well stocked your submarine is, you still need supplies, and to that end, I also have a Type 14, so-called milk cow, which was a variation of the Type 9D. It was a little shorter than the D, but a little wider. Wasn't armed except with defensive anti-aircraft guns, but it could carry extra torpedoes, fuel, even foodstuffs for other crews. And then we'll wrap up with kind of the final version, the Type 21 Electro boat, which was really the first true submarine in the modern sense of a vessel designed to primarily operate beneath the waves. All the previous ones here basically worked as destroyers, cruisers, diving only when necessary, but the Type 21 was the first really designed to spend most of its days underwater. Even though only a couple were in full service at the end of World War II, it was hugely influential on submarine designs for decades, and in fact, several Type 21s themselves were refurbished and commissioned into other navies, including the USA, Britain, and the Soviet Union. So yeah, we're going to kind of cover the whole fleet from its very beginning in 1935 all the way till its surrender in 1945. So with that said, let's get into it, talk a bit about the history, and kind of compare the differences in different types and designs of German U-boat. Really, I could begin with the Type 2, as this was developed around the same time and actually launched before, but might as well start with the Type 1. And something you'll notice about these models, they are cutaway on one side to show you interior things, torpedoes and stores and bulkheads to some extent, which is kind of interesting, I suppose. And the Type 1 was really Germany's first effort at an ocean-going, so long-range, submarine following World War I. As you know, in the Great War, Germany used U-boats, kind of in single target of opportunity styles, and they were pretty successful. And so the Treaty of Versailles severely limited Germany's surface naval fleet and outright banned their use of submarines. In the 1920s, to kind of get around these strictures, Germany worked with and set up several shell companies and other companies in places like Denmark and Finland to work on new designs and torpedoes and what have you. But of course, once Hitler came to power in 1933, much of this was kind of tossed out, so work on both the Type 1 and Type 2 really went underway by 1934. And the Type 1 here is based very heavily on a Finnish submarine design, and actually the company that helped develop this also helped develop the Soviet S-type submarine. So if you see one of the Soviet subs, they do look a little similar. In June of 1935, a new treaty, a bilateral agreement, was signed between the United Kingdom and Germany. It limited Germany's surface fleet to 35% tonnage of that of the UK's, but more importantly, it allowed Germany to have the same number of submarines as the UK, so they could officially have subs again, doing away with the Treaty of Versailles. The next month in July, Captain Karl Duritz was assigned as commander of the fledgling submarine or U-boat fleet, and he was a good choice because he had been a U-boat commander in World War I, although he did have his boat sunk out from under him and spent the better part of a year as a POW in Britain. He had experience with U-boats. Before this, he'd been commanding a cruiser and really wasn't keen on giving up the surface fleet, but he saw it could be his bailiwick, and he really had some ideas for how to use submarines, and he knew that they would be the best chance to basically put a stranglehold on the UK, choking off supplies. He figured if he had about 300 subs and could sink 700, 800,000 tons a month, he could successfully put the UK out of the war. At this time, in 1935-36, the political powers that be were promising all the military guys that there wouldn't be war till 1942 or so. It's ways off. So he had time to build up his U-boat fleet. And so with that, the first Type 1 was commissioned in February of 1936. And they would only build two of these. There'd be U-25 and there'd be U-26 here. It's a pretty large U-boat. It was relatively long range. It's over 237 feet long. It was considered about 700 tons. Had a crew of 4 officers and 39 men, so about, 43 all told. Quite impressively, it had 22 torpedoes on board. It had 6 tubes, and the other torpedoes are there for reloads. It also had a 4.1-inch deck gun and a couple of anti-aircraft guns. Throughout the time, these could change between 37mm and 20mm, just kind of depended, but gives you an idea. She could do about 21 miles per hour on the surface and a little less than 10 miles per hour submerged. And like all of these, it's going to be a diesel-electric hybrid. It was a competently done boat with decent range and of a decent size, and it would greatly influence later designs like this Type 7 and Type 9. But again, it was never really put into full production. It's said that the design itself was decent. It had, decent characteristics. It was a little on the slow side for diving and a little clunky on the maneuverability, but it had no great flaws. It really suffered from the not made here. I mean, it was built in Germany, but it wasn't designed there. It kind of just suffered from political objections. So instead, between 1936 and 1939, this was used to train Kriegsmarine crews on how to use the submarine to practice new tactics. Also to cruise around, basically waving the Nazi flag. But when war came early, on September 1st/September 3rd, 1939, Duritz only had 65 U-boats. Therefore, the 2 Type 1s were pressed into active service in 1940 and actually went on several cruises. I know U-25 went on 5 cruises and sunk 8 ships, but then it ran into a mine in August of 1940 and sunk, and then U-26 soon followed it. So both were put into the field in 1940, and both were lost that same year. It was a sign of things to come, though. And it was us getting into the submarine warfare. Now, Duritz had wanted to do wolfbacks. He basically wanted to station subs 10 to 20 miles apart in kind of a loose net in the way of convoys, and so when one sub would make contact with the convoy, the rest would come in and, attack. Circle in, fire torpedoes, go back out, circle back in, like a wolfpack. This would disorient the escorting destroyers, and just generally speaking, sow chaos. But with, just over 60 subs available in late 1939, he ended up having to send his subs out as quote-unquote lone wolves, much like during World War I. The only difference, he did set up a central command post using radio with coded instructions to at least do some type of coordination and not just have all the subs out doing their own thing. It was actually after a very daring attack, which I'll mention in a bit, on Scapa Flow in October of 1939 that convinced Hitler that the U-boat was a great asset. Duritz knew this already, but after that time, Hitler ordered a much higher priority on construction of U-boats, and so soon the fleet would begin to grow and grow and grow. Oh, one more thing on the Type 1. Its test depth was just over 650 feet. So moving to the Type 2, as you will Note, it is considerably smaller, whereas the Type 1 was early tests and experiments on an ocean going. This was always meant to be a coastal vessel, really designed to give Germany experience building, crewing, maintaining U-boats again. It too was designed by a Dutch shell company, and early construction and development work was done in Finland. Right after the agreement with the United Kingdom in June, not even 2 weeks later, U-1 was commissioned on June 29th, 1935. U-1 was a Type 2A. It would quickly be succeeded by the model Type 2B, which was a little longer. The A was about 134 feet long, 135 feet long. The B had 3 extra compartments. It was 140 feet long. Also a little more fuel. Next would come the C, which was even longer at 144 feet. Some more tankage and whatnot. Also, the C had more modern radio gear. And then the final version was the Type 2D, which was fitted with so-called saddle tanks, which doubled its admittedly short range. But these really were small little boats. They only had a crew of 25, 3 officers, and 22 enlisted. Actually, non-coms and enlisted. They had 3 torpedo tubes with a total of 5 torpedoes. They did not have a deck gun, but they did have an anti-aircraft cannon. They were a little slower than the Type 1 at about 14 to 15 miles per hour on the surface, and around 8 miles per hour, give or take, submerged. On the other hand, they were very quick to dive, especially the Type 2B and onward, and they could operate in shallow water. They were maneuverable, and they were very small, therefore very stealthy. They just didn't have a big signature. So for early on, 1939, 1940, they were pretty invisible little ships. But again, they had very limited armament and very limited range. They really could only operate near German waters or just, right there. Nevertheless, they did have some successes, and they were used early in the war. They would build a total of 50 of these. But as newer ships came along, the Type 2 was retired mostly to be a training boat, especially training young officers who are going out on their first commands, as well as handling of torpedoes. But interestingly, 6 Type 2s were dismantled and then shipped across and then reassembled and used in the Black Sea against the Soviet fleet during World War II. I don't know why I find that an interesting little factoid. Speaking of torpedoes, early on, German torpedoes were just straight runners. They weren't really guided. And they used either contact detonators or magnetic detonators. But interestingly, they had many of the same problems the U.S. did with their magnetic detonators. It really wasn't until 1942 that the German torpedoes became reliable, as well as the magnetic detonators. They would also try acoustic homing, but it was not successful. Really, had a little bit of success, but not really. But I just think that's interesting that the U.S. and Germany had much the same problem with their early World War II torpedoes. Of course, the U.S. kind of borrowed German research for their magnetic detonators, so I guess it's really no surprise. Like I told you, I have an example of a Type 2B and a Type 2C here. They're extremely similar models. There's just a little bit of difference in the antenna because of the different radio set in the C. Also, the C is ever so slightly longer in these models. You can barely tell, but in reality, there was about a 4-foot difference. So in the model, we're just talking fractions of an inch. Still, nevertheless, quite neat. These couldn't dive as deep. They could dive quick, but not as deep. Their test depth was about 490 feet. But again, coastal, shallow waters. It wasn't needed, and they were extremely, as you can imagine, cramped inside. Even though the crew was just 25, a lot of that space inside was taken up by fuel, food, other supplies, not really leaving the crew much room. Any World War II sub is going to be pretty tight, but the Type 2 was particularly tight. But this was never meant to be the mainstay of the U-boat fleet. This was, again, kind of a learning experience and more of a short coastal. And the benefit of these, they could build them quick, and they were relatively inexpensive. So even though they really stopped making them early in the war, the ones that survived did remain, at least some did remain in service until 1945. Some still a viable enough weapon of war, and again, they found them quite useful as a training device, so they weren't taking actual needed ships out of the rotation. But with that said, let's get to the ships that everyone came to enjoy. So right after the Type 1 and Type 2 were pretty much done in the design phase and going into construction, design work began on the Type 7. By 1934, they were really working on it. 35, construction was ready, and by 1936, the first ones, I believe it was U-30, was commissioned. This was a medium-range submarine, a little bit smaller than a Type 1, but much more capable than a Type 2. And I have two here. I have a 7B and a 7D. But for some reason, my 7D model, on the model's right, has a replica placard of the 7B. This is U-47. And the D is supposed to be marked U-214, but it's also marked U-47. So, I don't know, maybe it was on steroids, because it's obviously longer. Anywho, the 7A was the first version. It was kind of the smallest. It was just over 210 foot long and had 11 torpedoes. But they only would build about 10 of these. Soon it would give way to the 7B, which was 218 foot long and had 14 torpedoes, 5 tubes total, 4 bow and 1 stern. These could also be fitted with a rapid-firing 3.5-inch deck gun, as well as 20mm anti-aircraft guns. The maximum depth, or at least test depth, was quite a bit greater, between 700 and 750, depending on the exact model. Speed was again a lot like the Type 1, a little over 20 miles per hour surface, in between 8.5 and 9 miles per hour submerged. One thing that the B introduced were saddle tanks for extended range, as well as 2 rudders for greater control and maneuverability. And the Type 7 would end up being the so-called workhorse of the U-boat fleet. It could operate in relatively shallow waters. It could dive in 20 seconds or less. 14 torpedoes was quite respectable. The earliest version had a crew of 44 to 46. Later versions could have a crew from 44 to 48, and even later ones up to 52 officers and men. Again, reasonable range, not long range, but not short. This one here, U-47, flip it around, is the famous one I was talking about. On the night of October 13th, it snuck into the British Royal Navy port at Scapa Flow. See, it did it years before the UFO did. And lied in wait and sunk HMS Royal Oak, a battleship. And not only did it sink a British battleship in their home port, it got away scot-free. And this was a testament to the daring of the crew and captain, and also showed just how well this could operate in shallow water. So the 7B was a very early success. The 7C came next. It was slightly longer at 220 feet. Had a little extra fuel tankage, but was almost identical to the B, except that the C did have active sonar. The D is the big long version here. It was extended out to 253 feet, mainly in the back, where it was fitted with vertical mine launchers. It could, instead of being more of a torpedo boat, it was more of a mine layer. It could carry quite a few and launch them vertically underwater. There was also a resupply version known as the 7F that carried nearly 40 torpedoes, not for its own use really, but to resupply other subs. And the Type 7 was instrumental in the first so-called happy time. Duritz's submarines were doing very well in late 1939 and 1940, and by that time they were being produced in large enough numbers to start to form wolf packs as he had originally intended. And then after the fall of France, they had bases closer to the Atlantic and to the UK shipping routes. And so from June, July of 1940 through early 1941, it was pretty well open season for German U-boats. They had good bases, they had numbers, morale was very high, and the British had not really perfected mounting effective radar on their surface ships yet, and the system that would become known as Huff Duff was not in use yet. Air cover was very spotty, especially in the mid-Atlantic, giving the U-boats free range, and the Type 7 did have enough range to get to the mid-Atlantic, especially again from the French ports. So between July and November of 1940, 282 British ships were sunk. Of course, most were merchantmen, but not all. Some were military ships, warships, and, well, of course, not every U-boat survived. Their casualties were quite light. I'm sure most of you know the submarine service in the Kriegsmarine was voluntary, as it is in the U.S. Navy. It attracted young men, usually of a good mechanical aptitude, also of pretty good temperament. The men themselves were usually in their late teens, early 20s, and a lot of the commanders of the ships were actually just lieutenants, and they themselves were in their mid-20s. So they were young, relatively inexperienced, yet very daring officers, and this served them well early on. As did the boats themselves. They were well-made machines, reasonably fast and effective. I think the VIID is pretty neat with the extension, the little pallet in the back for the mines. I really should get a 7C, even though it's very similar to the B, because the 7C is kind of the workhorse of the workhorse. They would build over 700 Type 7s, and of those, over 500 were the 7C variant. But again, the only big difference was that it had active sonar. So it was kind of the ultimate. The 7C came into service in mid to late 1940. So before that, we just had the Bs in 1939 and early 1940. And of course, the mine-laying version, they made in relatively small numbers. I forget the exact number, but you get the idea. But yeah, this was the medium range. The Type 2 over here was the short range, the coastal. So with that said, let's get into the Type 9, the ocean-going, the long-range U-boat. The Type 7 gets kind of the most notoriety, and rightfully so. But I kind of have a soft spot for the Type 9. It's just a beast of a submarine. Like I said, this was their long-range, deep ocean-going variant. And this is kind of the culmination of really the Type 1, what they were going for. Here I have the Type 9 D2, and over here I have the Type 9 C. After the Type 7 was pretty much done with this design stage and going into production, they worked on the Type 9 based on their experience with the Type 1. Initial planning began in 1935, went through 1936, and the first vessels were laid down in 1937, and the first ones commissioned were in 1938. So some were ready when World War II began, but a very small number. But of course, construction would pick up. They would not build these in anything like the numbers of the Type 7, but they would build 195 total. So pretty big numbers. Second most common. The first version, the 9A, was about the same length as a 7D. It was 251 feet. Had 6 torpedo tubes, so one more than the 7, but it carried 22 torpedoes and had a crew of anywhere between 48 and 55. It could be mounted with a 4.1-inch deck gun as well as various anti-aircraft guns. Much like the Type 7, it could alternatively carry mines, either 44 or 66, depending on the size. Had about the same test depth of around 750 feet. But even from the beginning, really, the Type 9 had the range. It was less maneuverable, couldn't dive as fast, but it could go a lot further. It could carry more fuel and more provisions. It also had a double hull. The two-layer hull provided more room for fuel, but it also made the ship much more survivable, and also, of course, gave it greater depth. The 9B would be a further improved version, and actually by tonnage it would be the most successful version. It was just a little bit heavier. It would lead to the 9C, which had additional fuel tankage and would be the longest ranged version of them all. It's also just slightly longer at like 252 feet. The 9D. The 9D1 was kind of an experimental test of it. It was two of them made with different engines. It didn't work out, so the 9D2 replaced it, and it was the most common of the 9 ones. And that's the gargantuan one. It's over 287 feet long. Had a crew of 56 to 62. Carried 24 torpedoes, although it still just had 6 tubes, or the equivalent in mines. And the 9D did not have quite the range, just like maybe 1,000 miles less than the 9C, but it was a little faster. A little bit more maneuverable too. But mostly it just carried more stuff. It's also worth pointing out when they went from the 9B to the 9C, they deleted the control room periscope, little things like that. There really weren't as many changes by this point because it kind of had U-boats down. And the Type 9 became famous during what was known as the second happy time, or the golden time, or the American hunting season. The first happy time kind of ended in 1941 when the British finally developed better air cover, better convoy systems, better radar, etc. But then, right after Germany and Italy declared war on the United States on December 11th, the next day, Duritz began Operation Drumbeat, which was to send Type 9s deep into the Atlantic over to North America, targeting the coast between North Carolina and Maine, really homing in on New York and New Jersey, trying to disrupt shipping, mostly to keep stuff from getting to the UK, but also, to do what they could. And the first ships would leave their French ports on December 18th, 1941, with sealed orders. Crossing the Atlantic. And the first kills would be from U-123, that on the nights of January 14th and January 15th, it sunk 2 different oil tankers, really right outside New York City, New York Harbor. Interestingly, at this time, late 1941, there were only 20 Type 9s commissioned, and of those, 6 were available. So they were sent, but one of them had to turn back because of mechanical problems, meaning only 5 were sent initially. 3 of them kind of arrived around the same time, joined by their sister ships. Later, a second and then even a third wave of Type 9s would join them in February and March. And they really discovered America totally unprepared. The British had cracked the German cipher, so were reading the radio signals. They knew where those submarines were, at least roughly speaking, and they were in the United States, and this information was passed on to Admiral King. I don't want to get into why he didn't do it, but convoys were not arranged. Cities weren't even ordered to black out their lights. And therefore, shipping was just sitting duck. There weren't enough destroyers available. There weren't enough aircraft available. It really was just open season. And so the U-boats went at it and almost had carte blanche that winter and early spring. It got so enticing that they even managed to get some Type 7s over to North America by using resupply and refuel ships. I mean, they loaded these things to the brim, sometimes even replacing water on board with extra oil and fuel and whatnot to get them there. Even the Type 9s were loaded down as much as they could, as many torpedoes as they could hold. And in fact, most of them only returned home when they had expended all their ordnance. And it was just a big deal. If sinking of the Royal Oak had been a big victory for the VII, this whole campaign drumbeat for the IX was at steel, and several U-boat aces, as they were called, were made. It really wasn't until April that America started to organize convoys, started to make restrictions on lighting, started to have ships go during daytime and whatnot. But still yet, U-boats had a good time of it until around July or August, when it was said the second happy time would end. This was, by the end of that summer, finally America had started to organize competent defenses. Radar and air cover had improved. But yeah, during this period, over 600 ships were sunk. A good chunk, nearly a quarter total of the whole war, were sunk by U-boats, and at only the cost of 22 U-boats. That is a hell of an exchange, all said. The campaign in North America on the eastern seaboard was so successful that actually U-boats were even sent into the Gulf of Mexico to raid Texas, Louisiana, and etc. And of these, only one of the Gulf of Mexico U-boats was sunk. I believe it was U-66. But just really interesting event. But of course, it wasn't to last. By 1943, the tide was turning against the U-boats. And the happy times were definitely over. Type 9 construction would last until 1944. They planned to build about 100 more, but these were canceled when various things and whatnot, and a few were destroyed before they could be completed. Yeah, this was the long-range boat. So long that with a bit of planning and resupply, some were sent all the way over to help Germany's ally in Japan and transport materials and design specs and whatnot. So they really had some range, and 24 torpedoes on board plus a 4-inch deck gun is nothing to sneeze at. But really, none of that would have been possible, at least not for very long, without ships like these. The Type 14, the Milchka, the milk cow. After I'm done with these histories, I'm going to talk about the models a bit, how I got them. And this one was a particularly hard one to find, so not only do I think it's neat just for having a resupplier, but it was kind of fun getting it too. So stay tuned for that. We're hitting the home stretch. This was the only submersible tender ship of World War II. The Type 7F was a torpedo resupply ship, but this was the full service. This was the Walmart of the U-boat fleet. Design work began in 1940, and the first of these was commissioned after the first Happy Time in 1941. So the Type 14 was coming into service for the second Happy Time in 1942, and that is actually how the Type 7s were able to make it to and maneuver and operate in North American waters that year. Without the Type 14, it never would have happened. Yes, these could resupply torpedoes. They could also give diesel fuel for the other ship's engines. They also had motor oil for the machinery they could give. But probably even more important, food. These had freezers on board so they could have relatively fresh meat and vegetables that they could convey to the other subs. And I think kind of most interestingly and neat, they had a bakery on board so they could actually do fresh baked bread, pastries, what have you. And I can imagine after being at sea for weeks or months, just the smell of a fresh loaf of bread would be a huge morale boost. The Type 14 hull is based very heavily on the Type 9D. That's why it's kind of fat. Wide body for supplies. But it is shorter. It's about 220 feet. So actually more in line with the Type 7 as far as length. But again, girth, tonnage is much more. Had a crew of 53, 6 officers, 47 men, including non-coms. It actually had a very good test depth because it was based on the Type 9 hull. It could get down to 790 feet. But the crush depth of even, past 800. It had good range, more than a Type 7, not quite as good as a Type 9C or even a Type 9D, but still respectable considering all it was hauling with it. Speaking of, it did not have torpedo tubes itself, nor did it have a deck gun. But it did have 3 anti-aircraft guns, 2 1.5 inch, and 1 2 centimeter or 3/4 inch gun. These weren't as fast as the other U-boats. Most of the ones we've looked at had a, surface speed of 20-21 miles per hour and a submerged speed of between 8 and 10 miles per hour. Well, the milk cow, it's a milk cow. Its surface speed was around 17-18 miles per hour max, and its submerged speed was about 7.5 miles per hour. And you'd kind of wonder why something like this would need to worry about submerging. And the answer is simple. This was a huge target for Allied destroyers and aircraft. Because take out a normal Type 9 or Type 7, you knocked out one submarine. If you knock out the milk cow in that region, you might have stranded several Type 7s too far from home to get back without resupply, or you might have forced several Type 9s to turn back knowing they could not rearm. They planned to build 24 of these, but in reality, they only built 10 completely. This is because they realized these were big targets. As soon as the Type 7 started showing up in North American waters, they went after the milk cows. And by the end of 1943, 8 were already sunk. And by the summer of 1944, the last 2 were sunk. It was just a big target, plus the U-boat war was going in the wrong direction. The war on the continent was going in the wrong direction. So in May of 1944, the Type 14 program, along with a few other U-boat programs, was canceled. They had 3 other hulls in various stages of completion, but these were scrapped, and the other 11 planned were never built at all. So no Type 14s survive to this day. It really is amazing the rapidity with which they sought these out, and they were serious. This was a major threat to them. They used decoding intercepts, the newest seaborne and airborne radar, that Huff Duff I mentioned, and they went after these. So much so that of the 530 or some odd men that served in total on board milk cows, only about nearly 300 died. So the mortality rate was more than 50%. Most did not survive. I still love the fact that these had a bakery on board. Now, if they only had showers. Kind of wonder why they had a full crew of 53 as well. I mean, I guess it is smaller than some, but you think they could have left out some people to have even more room for cargo. But I guess, diesel subs of World War II just needed a minimum number of people to operate them regardless. But a neat seaboat, to be sure. I left the 9D out here for you to look at too, just to compare. You can see it has the same fat hull. It's just a little, the Type 14 is just a little shorter. Actually, I guess it's more than a little. It's 60 foot shorter, but it did what it needed to do. And that really completes the bulk of the U-boat fleet in World War II, with around 1,000 built. They sunk nearly 3,000 Allied ships. Of those, nearly 200 were military warships. The rest, of course, merchant and privates and other things. And while construction had more or less ended by 1944, at least of the Type 7 and Type 9, they did keep working on them. For example, many were fitted in 1944 with the snorkel. Typically, these would cruise on top of the water, diving when needed, but when they switched from their diesel engines, which required air, to go underwater with electric, that's why they were slower, and the electrics could only last so long. Of course, they also needed air for the crew. Then they have to surface again to recharge their batteries and get air and stuff. Well, the snorkel allowed them to cruise more or less at periscope depth underwater, taking in air for both the crew and the engines, meaning they didn't have to surface. Now, it was not a perfect system, but it definitely conveyed an advantage. So that gave the German U-boats a bit of an edge in late 1943, 1944, but then the Allies countered that with even better airborne radar and wider use of Huff Duff. So it was this back and forth pendulum. It was this kind of counter and counter back and forth to see who got the edge. And it was clear that the Type 7s and Type 9s, while very good technology when they were developed in the 1930s, were quickly becoming obsolescent in the mid-1940s. And Duritz knew this. He had never relinquished control and care of his submarine force. And he had something big on the horizon. The question was, would it come in time to even serve or be useful in the war? And that's where we get to the Type 21 Electro boat. On land, in the infantry, Germany in the late war had the Sturmgewehr STG-44. In the air, the Luftwaffe had the Messerschmitt Me-262. And in the oceans, the Kriegsmarine Admiral Duritz had the Type 21 Electro boat. Like the others, this was an extremely advanced piece of hardware, both in concept and design, and work had been going on for years. And these actually weren't really supposed to be ready until around 1946. But as the second happy time ended and the war began to turn, development was rushed and manufacturing began in 1943, with the first example commissioned in 1944. What to say about this? Okay. It was the first submarine designed to primarily operate underwater. To that end, it had mini batteries. It could actually stay underwater for days if prepared. It was also designed to use that snorkel, so even when it needed to recharge and take in air, it could do so just a few feet below the waves. It had a streamlined hull designed to minimize protuberances, have good water flow, and it was actually the first submarine to be faster underwater than above water. On the surface, it could do 18 miles per hour, so a little bit slower than our others, but under the water, it could just hit shy of 20 miles per hour, so double that of our other subs. Perhaps even more impressively, it had a silent running mode for being very stealthy, and even then it could do 11 miles per hour, so still faster than our other subs. It was 251 feet long, had 6 torpedo tubes with a total of 23 torpedoes. You could also split this and carry about a dozen torpedoes and about 10 mines. It didn't have a deck gun as such. Again, it was meant to be underwater, but it did have 2-centimeter anti-aircraft guns. Had a crew of around 55. Maximum depth, at least test depth, was 790 feet. And while it didn't have quite the range of the Type 9C, it definitely had greater range than the Type 7 series. It also had passive sonar. Remember early on we introduced active sonar. Well, this had passive. In fact, this is that little nodule on the bottom here. Even its construction was advanced. The idea was to build these from prefabricated sections of hull made at different subcontractors and then brought to the shipyard for final assembly. And therein lies kind of the problem. Late war, of course, skilled labor was less and less available. Many factories were bombed, and unfortunately, more and more slave labor was used. So when these sections were brought for final assembly, these were supposed to be able to be built in 6 months or less per sub, but they found they spent more and more time getting the parts to fit and work together because of poor quality control. Even when they got them together, the ships suffered from mechanical failures, both from design problems and just quality control, fit and finish, issues, whatnot. They also were not especially durable. They couldn't take a lot of damage in combat. Of particular note, a lot of their hydraulic systems were running around the outside of the hull, so were easily damaged. Which is not surprising considering it literally was rushed into service. Germany, ever the optimists, especially late war, had planned to build over 1,000 of these. They were in the process of constructing quite a few, nearly 300 when the war ended. They had actually built 118 to 120, depending on who you ask. Of those, 4 were commissioned. And of those, 2 of them were actually sent out on patrol in 1945. Now, no kills have been attributed to the Type 21, although one of the captains of the 2 claimed he could have fired upon a British ship, but did not. Really, the Type 21's legacy is after World War II. This was a hugely influential design. Both the US and Russia fielded these, mostly for research, of course, but still they did, in their own navies. Russia officially had 4 of them. People speculate they had probably upwards of 15 and could have built another 40 based on all the parts they captured, but according to treaty they were supposed to just have 4. The USA commissioned 2 in their navy. The UK and France, it both commissioned 1. Again, mostly for research, but not entirely. Some were in more straight-up service, because design faults and quality control issues aside, it was a very fast, very advanced, very silent submarine. In learning lessons from these, several 1950s designs would take inspiration, such as the American Tang class and the Soviet Whiskey class, and many others. This one here, U-2540, has an interesting history. She was actually scuttled at the end of the war by her crew in 1945. But then 1957, she was raised and refurbished and refit by the West German Bundesmarine and actually served in the military as well as being used for civilian research purposes until 1983, when she was finally commissioned in 1984. So what a cool history. I mean, it's amazing to me that a ship that sat on the bottom of the ocean for over a decade was still even usable, much less usable for 25 years. France, too, kept its in service until the 1960s. And really these didn't give way until nuclear subs were firmly a thing. But it just goes to show you. If Germany had had these a couple of years earlier, would it have changed the ultimate outcome of the war? No, but it could have definitely given Germany the edge in that arms race, that brinksmanship, the one-upsmanship in 1943 if it had come a year or so earlier. But it did not. But it goes to show you that they weren't just resting on their laurels, that they really were trying to make advanced submarine designs. Even at the end, they weren't just working on the 7s and the 9s. Even though, because these are basically World War I tech. I mean, they had plenty of advantages, especially like the snorkel and newer torpedo styles and things. But yeah, this was truly a new thing. Oh, and by the way, they actually for once thought about crew comfort. There was more privacy on board. They even had the freezers like for the milk cow. So they were trying to provide better food and accommodations because the morale of the U-boat fleet was very important. And I'm not going to get into politics, but it's well known that the Kriegsmarine, especially the U-boat division, was pretty apolitical. Duritz was not a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi at all. He was definitely a serviceman, so he kind of discouraged a lot of political stuff. He kept it to the minimum required. And that shows because when he was put on trial at the end of World War II, he received a relatively light sentence and then got out of prison and lived the rest of his life. He was not really directly implicated in any war crimes, but it has to be said that the submarine pin that was being constructed in 1943 and 1944 to make the Type 21 was built using slave labor, but it was actually destroyed right before it was completed in 1945 by British Grand Slam bombs. So, I mean, Duritz had to have been at least somewhat aware of what was happening. Just trying to give a fair part of history here, but yeah, keeping the politics out. But the Kriegsmarine was known for quite a bit of honorable kind of rules of the sea type behavior, and definitely was less tarnished than other German branches. But that's all I have to say about that. Well, let me end with a little bit of story time about the models themselves and how I picked them up, and then I'll let you go this evening. Well, I really appreciate you sticking with me for this pretty long one, but with the shut-in stuff right now, if there's ever been a time for long videos, I figured why not. And one reason it took me quite a while to do this one is I was waiting on these two little guys, the Type 2s. A lot of these I just ordered from various places, namely Aikens, but they didn't have any of the Type 2s. But another place I've actually been buying from longer than them, and I've had good luck with, Diecast Supermart. They're about the only folks that had the Type 2s. I think Flying Mule might have had them as well. And I put them on an order with some other things and waited, and that's when the whole COVID stuff really got going. After about 3 weeks, I kind of emailed them saying, hey, no rush, but I think the order might ship, because usually they're pretty Johnny on the spot about shipping. Well, it turns out one of the items I'd put on the order, a British submarine, was showing in stock on the site, but in reality it was a pre-order or a back order, so it had the wrong status, and I told them, I'll just take it off the order and please ship what you've got. And they did immediately, and it came in just a few days. So I almost did this video without the Type 2s, because in a way they're not hugely instrumental in the U-boat story. But in other ways, they're really interesting because they're the smallest ones, and I would have felt kind of bad not doing a complete story. The same with having the Type 1 here. Yeah, they only made 2 of them, but it's really emblematic of what was coming. It really just shows the development. For the Type 7s and the Type 9s, getting those is pretty easy. Several places have them. But the one that was hard to get was the milk cow. In fact, no website I found had it. So I resorted to Amazon, and the seller had 1 left in the milk cows. And I snapped that up, and luckily it wasn't at any kind of price gougy pricing. It was just the normal price. So I was really happy to get it, because again, nowhere else seems to have these. And you know, the atlases come from Italy, so who knows when we might see more. The Type 21, I think I've only seen at Aikens. They definitely seem to be selling out pretty quick out there everywhere else. But yeah, I've been looking at these subs for a year or two. It was just a little reluctant. I wasn't sure. I didn't have anything in 1/350 scale. I wasn't sure how much metal they would be versus plastic. And I wasn't sure about the cutaway thing. I thought that might kind of bug me. It really doesn't. I kind of would have liked it even better if they'd shipped them with like a little panel you could pop in, kind of like on a Hobby Master, just to plug it up. But it's not bad. And again, you can always just put them on the other side if you don't want to see it. The wooden stands are nice. I mean, it's just, you know, IKEA wood, but it's wood, it's not plastic. And the little nameplates are actually metal. They're kind of tacked on. And yeah, the hulls of these are all metal. And really only the top decking surfacing is the plastic. And even under it's not like hollow metal, it's pretty solid metal. And even some of the deck is metal too. So they're pretty neat models, and I like the scale. I wish there were more warships in it, but it just seems like it's the U-boats. Another reason I really wasn't up on all my U-boat subtypes, and I didn't want to just, you know, buy them half-cocked. I wanted to know what I was buying. So it took me time just to kind of read up and memorize all the differences and really get which ones I wanted. And I was happy to find out that they pretty much have the entire fleet. You know, we've got the Type 1, 2 Type 2s. They do make the Type 7C, but since it's so similar to the Type 7B, didn't really see why to get both. And haven't seen a Type 9B. I've just seen the 9C and the 9D. But yeah, and of course the milk cow. There's a couple of others they could have done, like the Type 10, which was a dedicated mine layer, but that's alright. They do, Germany did have some so-called midget submarines, and that'd be kind of neat. But yeah, kind of a neat little U-boat fleet. And the prices on these are very fair, I think, too, for the quality. They're about $25 for the smaller models, and for the bigger, more complicated ones, they're about $35. And there's some really big ones, like the French undersea cruiser, which are about $40 because of how big they are. But yeah, if you'd like to see more sub videos, let me know, or whatnot. I'll try to do them while we're all on lockdown. They probably won't be this long, but hey, it's a Sunday, so it gives you something to do, right? Hope you all are staying well and safe. Sometimes it feels like it would be better just to be in a submarine and isolated for a few weeks, doesn't it? But yeah, which one do you like? What's your favorite? Do you like the classic 1 or 2? Do you like the workhorse, the 7? Do you like the long range big boy, the 9? Or do you like the Type 21? Or do you think the Type 14, the milk cow, like me, is kind of interesting? Let me know what you think. Let's have a discussion. Well, with that said, guys, I'm going to call it an evening. I greatly appreciate it. And, yeah, this is Misha. And I will catch you very soon next time.